Woman laughs at black farmer's clothes, then learns he owns the land. It all began on a quiet, sun-drenched afternoon in the small rural town of Millstone. The air smelled of fresh earth and hay, and the fields rolled out for miles in every direction. Out there, where the wind carried the sound of birds and the hum of tractors, a man named Elias Brown worked alone under the heat. Elias was a tall, broad-shouldered black farmer in his late 40s, with the calm strength of someone who'd lived most of his life under the open sky. His hands were rough, his face lined from years of sun and struggle. His clothes were simple, a faded shirt, dirt-streaked overalls, and old leather boots that had seen too many seasons. To him, they were just tools of his trade. To others, they were easy reasons to judge. That day, as Elias fixed a section of the fence bordering his field, he heard the growl of an engine approach. A brand-new silver SUV rolled down the dusty road and stopped right near where he worked. The contrast was almost comical, chrome and glass beside soil and sweat. The door opened and out stepped Vanessa Caldwell, a woman who seemed built for city life, not the countryside. Her white pantsuit gleamed in the sunlight. Her manicured nails matched her red heels, and her sunglasses covered half her face. She was the kind of woman who lived for appearances. And right now, she didn't like what she saw. She looked at Elias, standing in his muddy boots, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Her expression twisted in distaste, and then she laughed, a quick, sharp sound that cut through the quiet air. To her, he looked like a poor farmhand, someone who barely scraped by, someone beneath her. She didn't see the acres stretching behind him, the barns he built with his own hands, or the history buried in that soil. All she saw was a man in dirty clothes. Elias didn't react. Years of hard work had taught him patience, even when people's eyes carried judgment. He tipped his hat politely and kept working, his silence speaking louder than her laughter. Vanessa walked closer, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. She was irritated now, brushing at her pants to avoid the dust. She had come to the area because she was looking to buy more land, a plot next to her new mansion that she wanted to expand into a private garden. Her realtor had told her the land belonged to some local farmer. She assumed it would be easy to buy. She assumed wrong. She called out to Elias asking about the property, but her tone wasn't kind. It was condescending, the kind used when someone talks down to a stranger they think they're better than. Elias answered calmly, his voice deep and even. He told her the land wasn't for sale. Vanessa didn't like that. She smirked, looking around at the fields and the old farmhouse in the distance. She thought he was being proud for no reason, clinging to something he didn't deserve. She even muttered something about how people like him should be grateful for any offer. Then, with another quick laugh, she walked back to her car, her heels clicking on the gravel. Elias watched her go, his expression unreadable. He'd met her type before, people who thought money gave them power over respect. But he also knew something she didn't. The land she wanted so badly was already his. In fact, her new mansion, the one she bragged about owning, sat on a portion of his inherited property. Land her developer had leased, not bought outright, and that lease was about to expire. The sun dipped low that evening, painting the fields gold. Elias finished his work quietly, his mind steady, his heart unshaken. The laughter of that woman lingered faintly in the air, but he didn't let it bother him. Life had a way of revealing truth, and sooner or later, she would learn who really held the ground beneath her feet. The next day came with heavy clouds. Vanessa woke in her mansion on the hill, a modern home of white stone and glass that overlooked the valley. She had everything she'd ever wanted, luxury, influence, and control. But still she wasn't satisfied. She wanted more land, more space, more proof that she was above everyone around her. She got dressed in another expensive outfit and decided to drive out again to look at the property. Maybe she'd make that farmer an offer he couldn't refuse. Money always talked, and she was sure he'd listen. But as she turned onto the narrow dirt road leading toward Elias's farm, the weather shifted. The clouds broke open and rain began to pour, turning the road into thick mud. Vanessa's SUV slid and struggled, its tires spinning uselessly. She cursed under her breath, pressing harder on the gas, but it only sank deeper. By the time she realized she was stuck, She was right in the middle of Elias's field. The rain came harder, and the car tilted slightly in the soft ground. She honked the horn in frustration. But there was no one around. No cell signal, no passing cars. Just the sound of rain and her own panic. From the distance, Elias saw the headlights. He recognized the car immediately. For a moment, he thought about leaving her there, letting her feel what it was like to be helpless in a place she didn't respect. But that wasn't who he was. He walked toward her slowly, his boots sinking into the mud, rain dripping from his hat brim. When Vanessa saw him approaching through the downpour, her pride cracked. The same man she had laughed at yesterday. The dirty farmer, it was now her only hope. She lowered her window just enough to ask for help, her voice trembling with impatience. Elias didn't say much. He just nodded, grabbed his tractor, and went to work pulling her vehicle out of the mud. The rain softened as the SUV finally rolled free. Vanessa stepped out, soaked and muddy, her perfect white clothes ruined. For the first time, she looked small, unsure, and deeply embarrassed. Elias stood there silently, wiping the rain from his face, ready to walk back to his work. But before he could, Vanessa noticed something behind him. A sign by the edge of the field, half hidden by weeds. It read, "Property of Brown Family Farms, established 1948. Her eyes widened. The land she'd looked down on, the man she'd mocked, it all belonged to him. And that was just the beginning. The storm had passed, but the lesson had only begun. Vanessa stood beside her gleaming SUV, her white clothes now streaked with mud, her pride drowned somewhere in the puddles around her feet. The sign she had just noticed, Brown Family Farms, stared back at her like a silent rebuke. It took a few seconds for the truth to sink in, but when it did, it cut deep. She had mocked the man who owned everything she admired. The fields that rolled into the horizon, the tall oaks lining the road, even the soil beneath her car tires. All of it was his. Elias Brown, the man she had laughed at, wasn't some poor worker trying to get by. He was the owner. Vanessa's heart pounded. The rain had turned her elegant appearance into a mess, and for the first time, she felt small in a world she thought she controlled. She wanted to say something, to apologize maybe. But Elias had already started walking back toward his tractor, moving with that same quiet strength that she had mistaken for weakness. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Back at his farmhouse, Elias washed up, poured himself a cup of coffee, and watched the sky lighten through the window. He wasn't the type to gloat or hold grudges, but he did believe in balance. That life always found a way to show people the truth about themselves, and that woman had a truth coming. The next morning, Vanessa returned home with a restless mind. Her mansion stood tall and proud, a symbol of her wealth, but now it felt hollow. Every time she looked out her window toward the open fields, she remembered his face, calm, patient, grounded. She couldn't stop thinking about that sign. Still, her pride wouldn't let her admit fault. Instead, she decided to double down. She called her lawyer and her realtor, asking them to draw up an offer for the land. She didn't care how much it cost. She wanted to buy it, to own it, to erase the humiliation she felt. But what she didn't realize was that the land wasn't for sale. Elias had turned down bigger offers than hers before. Developers had tried to buy pieces of it for years, for malls, golf courses, and new homes, but Elias always said no. The land carried his family's history. His grandfather had fought for it. His father had protected it. And now it was his turn to keep it safe. Later that week, Vanessa drove back out to the farm. Not in her white suit this time, but in jeans and boots, trying to look more approachable. She rehearsed her lines in the mirror. Before leaving home, determined to sound confident, not desperate. Elias was by the barn when she arrived, fixing the roof. He looked down as she called out to him, but his expression didn't change. He could tell by her tone she hadn't come to apologize. She started talking fast about business, about opportunity, about how buying this land would benefit everyone. She offered him more money than anyone had before, a number that would have tempted most men. But Elias just shook his head slowly. It wasn't anger that made him say no. It was principle. This land wasn't for sale at any price. It wasn't just property. It was legacy, roots, blood. He explained in his calm voice that owning something wasn't just about money. It was about meaning. And some things couldn't be bought. Vanessa's smile faltered. She tried to convince him again, but it was useless. The answer stayed the same. Eventually, she got back in her car, more frustrated than before. For the first time in her life, money had failed her. Days passed, weeks even, but something in Vanessa began to shift. She found herself thinking about Elias more than she wanted to. Not in the way she used to, not with judgment or disdain, but with a strange kind of respect. She remembered how he stood tall even when she belittled him. How he helped her without hesitation, even after the way she'd treated him. There was dignity in that, something she'd never seen up close before. Then one morning, Vanessa got a call that shook her world again. Her realtor told her that there was an issue with the property lying on her mansion's estate. A boundary mistake, made by the construction company. Years ago, the edge of her backyard, including her prized flower garden, wasn't legally hers. It sat on land that still belonged to Elias Brown. Her hands went cold. That small strip of land might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but it represented something bigger, control. And now she didn't have it. She couldn't sell her home or make changes to the land without Elias's consent. She didn't just want his property anymore. She needed his cooperation. When she drove back to his farm again, it was different. There was no laughter this time, no sharp tone. She stepped out quietly, humbled, and found him tending to his crops near the same fence where they first met. The dirt road was the same. The man was the same. But Vanessa wasn't. As she approached, Elias turned toward her, waiting for her to speak. She didn't talk about business this time. She didn't bring papers or offers. Instead, her voice was softer, almost unsteady. She explained the mistake, admitted she needed his help. And for the first time, she said she was sorry for how she had treated him. Elias listened. There was no satisfaction in watching her struggle. He'd seen too much life to take pleasure in someone's regret. Instead, he nodded, told her they would sort things out, and went about making arrangements to fix the boundary peacefully. That evening, as Vanessa sat in her car before leaving, she looked out over the wide land again. The sun was setting over Elias's fields, casting long shadows that glowed with gold and amber. For the first time, she saw beauty not in the price of the land, but in the man who had cared for it all his life. And for the first time, she envied not his property, but his peace. Still, the story wasn't over yet. The real test of her character was coming, and it would show whether she had truly learned her lesson or not. Because soon, the same land she mocked would be the one that decided both of their futures. Weeks turned into months after. Vanessa's uneasy truce with Elias, the boundary issue, had been resolved fairly, just as he promised. He allowed her to keep using the small strip of land behind her mansion, but only under one condition: that it would remain open and untouched, free of construction or greed. It was a simple request, but one that carried meaning. Vanessa agreed, and for a while everything between them stayed peaceful. But peace never lasted long in Vanessa's world. She was a woman used to movement, to winning, buying, and conquering. And though her tone had softened toward Elias, her ambition had not. She began hosting gatherings at her mansion. Again, high society dinners, filled with business owners, politicians, and wealthy couples from the city. She liked being admired, envied, respected. Yet every time she looked out past her polished glass, windows toward the farmer's fields, a quiet guilt gnawed at her. She couldn't forget how she'd laughed at him. One afternoon, as she sat with a glass of wine on her porch, she saw Elias working the field across the road. The sight was almost poetic. The rhythmic motion of his hands, the calm way he guided his plow. His truck was old but steady, his posture proud. And for the first time, Vanessa saw something she hadn't noticed before. How deeply that land seemed to belong to him. It wasn't ownership by paper or title. It was ownership by soul. But her circle of friends didn't see it that way. During one of her garden parties, a guest noticed Elias working nearby and made a joke about the local farmer and his antique tractor. The group laughed, and for a brief moment, Vanessa joined in, out of habit, out of pride, out of fear of seeming different. But the laughter didn't sit right with her anymore. It echoed in her mind like her own voice had that first day, cruel and hollow. That night she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, replaying every moment of their first meeting. his silence, his patience, his kindness when she didn't deserve it. The contrast between who he was and how she treated him became unbearable. A few days later, fate found another way to humble her. A major storm rolled through. Millstone County, the kind that didn't ask permission. Rain came down in sheets, and the wind ripped through the valley with a roar. Trees bent, fences fell, and roads disappeared beneath flooding mud. By morning, Vanessa's mansion stood damaged. Her beautiful garden was gone, her outdoor lights shattered, her driveway washed out. Power lines were down, and her staff couldn't make it through the flooded roads. She stood helpless on her porch, raincoat wrapped tight, looking out at the wreckage. But then, through the gray mist, she saw movement in the distance, a figure walking up the hill, pulling a small cart behind him. It was Elias. He had come to check on her. Without a word, he started helping, clearing debris, cutting away fallen branches, stacking sandbags by her driveway. His clothes were soaked, his hands muddy, but his focus never wavered. When she tried to speak, to thank him, he only nodded and kept working. It wasn't pity. It was compassion, the kind that came naturally to good people. By nightfall, the storm had eased, and the damage was under control. Vanessa stood by her porch, watching Elias prepare to leave. Something in her finally broke. The wall she had built around herself, the one made of pride and money and image. She realized that everything she valued, the house, the car, the clothes, had nearly washed away in one night. But what stood firm was the man she once mocked. The next day, she went down to his farm. For once, she didn't dress up. No makeup, no jewelry, just a plain sweater and jeans. Elias was by his barn again, repairing a broken fence post. When he saw her, he paused, waiting quietly. Vanessa walked closer, her shoes sinking slightly in the soft earth. She didn't come to make another offer or to defend herself. She came to face what she'd become. Standing there, she told him everything she had never said. How wrong she'd been. How she had judged him without knowing his story. How ashamed she was of her own arrogance. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. Elias listened in silence, his expression calm. When she finished, he didn't respond with anger or mockery. Instead, he simply nodded, the faintest hint of a smile touching his face. Then he handed her a tool, an extra hammer, and told her there was always work to be done if she meant what she said. And so, for the first time in her life, Vanessa worked on a farm. It started awkwardly, her movements clumsy, her shoes wrong for the mud. But with each hour that passed, she found something new stirring inside her. A strange peace, the kind that came from doing something real, something honest. As days turned into weeks, she began visiting more often. Sometimes she helped feed the animals. Other times, she just sat by the fence and watched the sunset over the fields. Elias never said much, but he didn't need to. His quiet presence spoke enough. The town started to notice the change in her. The woman who once looked down on everyone now greeted people by name, asked about their families, and even helped at the community market. Her mansion became less of a symbol of pride and more of a meeting place for neighbors after the storm. And though she didn't realize it at first, Elias had noticed the change too. He could see the humility in her eyes, the kind that only comes from being broken and rebuilt by life. But as the seasons shifted and the harvest came near, a new challenge was about to test that growth, one that would show whether Vanessa's transformation was real or just temporary guilt. A big development company from the city arrived in Millstone, offering to buy up most of the farmland around them, and including Elias's. Their plan was to build a luxury resort across the valley. They offered more money than anyone in the county had ever seen. Vanessa was one of the first people they contacted, hoping she could convince Elias to sell. And that was when she realized this was her real moment of truth. Would she side with the world she came from? The one that prized wealth over worth? Or would she finally stand beside the man she once laughed at and protect the land that had changed her forever? The morning mist hung low over the valley, softening the edges of the fields as the first light of dawn spilled across the soil. Elias was already awake, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the land breathe. It was quiet in that sacred way only the countryside could be, the hum of cicadas fading, the whisper of wind through corn stalks rising to replace it. But this morning felt different. heavy, restless. Word had spread through Millstone that developers from the city had returned. Men in suits with polished shoes and big promises. They wanted to buy up the farmland and turn the valley into something shiny, loud and profitable. They talked about revitalization and modern luxury, but to Elias, it sounded like erasure. They wanted to pave over stories. His family's, his father's, his grandfather's, stories rooted deep in that soil. Across the hill, Vanessa Caldwell stood at the tall windows of her mansion, watching the same sunrise, but her heart was far from calm. She'd spent the night staring at the proposal, sitting on her desk, a contract that would make her wealthier than she had ever imagined. All she had to do was convince Elias Brown to sell. The developers believed she could do it easily. After all, they thought she was one of them. Rich, persuasive, well-connected. They didn't know how much she had changed. Vanessa closed her eyes, remembering the first time she'd met Elias, the day she laughed at him. She could still see the mud on his boots, the lines on his face, the quiet power in his eyes. Back then, she saw nothing but a poor farmer. Now, she saw a man who had something money couldn't buy: peace, legacy, purpose, and she wanted to protect it. By noon, cars began to roll into Millstone. 3 black SUVs stopped at the local diner, where the developers planned to meet with Elias and several landowners. Vanessa arrived not long after, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. The men at the table greeted her warmly. They thought she was there to help them. One of them, the head of the firm, smiled confidently, handing her a folder. Inside were detailed maps, blueprints, and projected profits. They promised new jobs, tourism, and economic growth. But all Vanessa could see was the destruction of everything she had learned to value. Elias walked in a few minutes later. The room grew quieter. He nodded to everyone and took a seat near the window, his hat resting on the table. His calm presence unsettled the developers. They began pitching their offer, their voices slick with charm and practiced greed. When they finished, all eyes turned to Elias. He said nothing at first, just looked out the window at the fields, as if the land itself was whispering to him. Finally, he spoke, soft but steady. He thanked them for their offer, said he appreciated their time, and told them plainly that the answer was no. His family's land wasn't for sale. Not now, not ever. The developers pressed harder, their smiles fading. One of them leaned forward, saying they could guarantee Vanessa's cooperation, since her property bordered his. Vanessa froze. The room turned toward her. Elias's gaze met hers, steady, quiet, unreadable. That was the moment of truth. Vanessa took a deep breath, feeling every ounce of her old pride crumble away. Then, with a calm she didn't know she possessed, she told the developers she wouldn't be part of it, that the land didn't need saving. The people who lived on it had already done that generations ago. The silence that followed was thick. One of the men scoffed, muttering something under his breath about sentiment over progress. Elias didn't respond. He simply stood, tipped his hat, and walked out of the diner. Vanessa followed. Outside, the sky had turned gold again, the same color it was the day they first met. The breeze carried the scent of earth and corn and quiet triumph. Elias stopped by his truck, turning slightly as Vanessa approached. For a moment, they just stood there. 2 people from different worlds. Bound now by something greater than pride or money, Vanessa finally spoke, her voice low but sure. She thanked him, not for the favor he'd done, but for the lesson he'd taught her. That worth wasn't measured in wealth or titles, but in what you stand for when the world tries to buy your soul. Elias gave a slow nod. You learned what the land already knew, he said softly. Then he climbed into his truck and drove off down the dirt road, the sound of the engine fading into the hum of summer. Vanessa stood there a while longer, watching the dust settle. In that moment, she realized something profound she didn't need to own, everything around her to feel whole. For the first time in her life, she felt content to belong instead of to possess. Over the next few months, she began using her resources differently. She started a small community fund to help local farmers, repair equipment and barns damaged by storms. She opened her land for local gatherings, turning her mansion into a hub for small-town festivals and charity events. And whenever she needed perspective, she'd walk down to the edge of Elias's farm. He was always there, steady as the sunrise, working the soil that had carried his family for generations. Sometimes they'd share a quiet wave from across the fence. No more words were needed. Years later, long after the developers had moved on, the valley remained untouched, alive, breathing, full of stories. The wildflowers grew taller, the corn greener, the soil richer, and every now and then, someone new would drive by, seeing Elias out in his field, wearing the same dirt-stained overalls that once made someone laugh. But if they looked a little closer, they'd notice the woman standing beside him, helping plant the next row, her hands dirty, her clothes plain, her face peaceful. Because sometimes, the richest thing a person can own isn't land, or money, or reputation. It's humility. And that, Vanessa Caldwell learned, is something no one can ever buy.